All right, we're talking about clays, and we talk about clays, excuse me, are the smallest soil particles, and when they get wet, they swell. They are also, let's just say you have some water here stirred up. Let's just say it's a lake, but we'll just say, and you have all these soil particles. Okay, once the river is carrying these soil particles and they come into the lake, then they're going to the water's not moving around as much, not flowing anymore, and so a lot of this will settle out. And the first to settle out are going to be your larger particles. That's going to be your sand particles, and then your silt ones would be next. And the very last ones are going to be your clay particles. And so you end up with a layer of clay on the bottom. And this is true of most ponds, lakes, or even mud puddles. All right. And if you look at a mud puddle after it dries up, you will notice that it shrinks and makes like little plates and curls up on the edges. Okay. And you'll see all these little things curled up like this. All right, if you're looking down on it, you'll see cracks in the ground with little cracks in between them, okay, where they have curled up, okay? But basically, that's because it's doing the same thing. It's when it gets wet, it'll swell and it looks like a solid layer on the bottom, but when it dries, it shrinks up and leaves cracks in it. And you may see in your yard, you may see big cracks in the middle of summer in July and August when it's been hot and dry for a long time, and they may go down 6 inches or deeper in the ground. These cracks are, and that's because it has clay in it, and these clay particles shrink and pull apart. All right, but since they're the last ones to settle down, they're usually on top of the puddle or on top of the lake bottom, and that's good because when they get wet, they swell and they shut and they don't let the water go through, and that's why it allows the pond or lake to hold water longer, and that's actually a good thing for the lake or the pond. All right, and that's basically it for the three soil particles. Now, most soils are not going to be one or the other. If you went to the beach, it might be just sand. That's why beaches are known for their sand, because they only have sand and that's it. Okay, we said like when the river dumps mud, a lot of times it'll be silt or silt and clay that gets dumped in people's homes and makes them so nasty to live in after a flood. But most soils are going to be some kind of a combination of all three of those. And when we have a combination of all three, we call that a loam soil. Okay, so it's a soil with all three types of soil particles. And to be honest, most soils are going to be some type of combination. It's just a matter of which ones do you have the most of. All right, and we're going to look at a device that helps us to see how they classify these soils, called a soil texture diagram or triangle. And we'll look at that in just a second. All right, now we're all set up for that, and here we have a soil texture diagram. Okay, the soil texture diagram, we've colored in some of these already, so it's a little harder to read. I'm sorry for that, but at the top we have clay. Okay, and as you can see, a large segment of this are what we could consider clay soils of some sort or another. And then there's some medium texture soils, and there's some other ones here. We'll talk more about what those mean here in a minute. But basically, you have three sides of the triangle. Over here, you have percent clay, because we could have clay particles. How much of the clay, particles in a soil are clay? Over here on the other side, we have percent silt, and across the bottom, we have percent sand. And if you add these three together, you should end up with 100% at any given time. Okay, so let's just say that we have a soil that is 1/3 clay, 33%, 1/3 silt, 33%, and 1/3 sand. All right, well, here's the clay over here on the side. It goes 0, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100. So 33 would be about right here. Now, the clay lines on this triangle, you have three sets of lines, and the clay lines run straight across from side to side. They go this way. So if you want to draw the line out here side by side, showing that little line there, that's the direction the clay lines run. They run that direction. Okay, and so the 33 line would be roughly about where we're putting that line right there. Anywhere along that line would be 33% clay, but it would have different amounts of silt or sand mixing with that. Okay, now the silt lines over here, we say here, they go from this top corner down to the bottom corner, 0, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100. Okay, and so if we were going to put at 33, here's 20, there's 30, 33 would be somewhere about there. Okay, now if we did this right, they would cross right here, and that would be our correct answer. Okay, right there, that would be our soil type. Okay, but let's just go one step farther. Okay, just to check and make sure we did it right, if we do the sand line, it should also line up and cross about the same spot. Sand lines run diagonally this direction, like this line here, and they go 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100 across this direction. So 33 would be about right there, and sure enough, that does cross right where the other two, which means we did it correctly. Okay, so where all these lines cross, that tells us what type of soil. Now, for this particular type of soil, that means it would be a clay loam. All right, and it would be, if you look up here on the color chart, it would be moderately fine soil. Okay, notice that the soil texture goes anywhere from fine, which is the very smallest particles in yellow here, to moderately fine, to medium, which would be down here in the loam, silty loam area, and it would be coarse, which is over here in the sandy area where it's very coarse because you have very big structure or size particles. All right. Now, a couple things you'd like to know is this is a clay loam. Okay, the loam tells us that there are other types of soil particles. It has all three. In fact, we know it's evenly all three. And yet, of those three, the most important one is clay. That makes it a clay loam. Okay, like down here in the sand corner, there is a sandy loam, meaning it's all three, but sand is the most important one. And over here you have a silt loam, which means it has all three, but silt is the most common one. If you notice though, clay takes and the fine texture has the biggest part of the soil triangle. In fact, if you put a sandy clay loam down here, and clay loam and clay silty loam, or silty clay loam, notice that all these have clay in the name, and they're all up here and take the bulk of it. It doesn't take much clay to have a big impact on the soil because of the way it swells and shrinks and does those other things. It has a big impact, and so you can see that the bulk of the pyramid involves some type of clay. Now, if you're looking at which is the most important, say for example here we have a sandy clay loam. Loam tells us there's all three. It's a clay loam, so that tells us clay is the most important one, but of the sand and silt, it's a sandy clay loam. So there's very little silt over here, but there is some, so it's a loam, but clay is the most important, and then sandy is next. So really, the last word is the most important. A sandy clay is mostly clay, but it's got a lot of sand in it. A silty clay would be a clay primarily, that's number one thing, but then it would be, the next most common would be silt. Okay, notice as you increase the amount of sand, then you get into loams. And so instead of just being silt and clay, sand is important enough that it becomes a loam, and it's all a mixture of all three. So basically, in order of importance, you start at the end, last word, that's the most important. Then, as you go back this way, it tells you the next most important soil. And so that's kind of how the naming and the texture works. Texture just has overall the amount of size of the particles in it. The more clay, it's more fine. The more sand, it's more coarse. Silt's going to be kind of in the middle, in the moderate area. Okay, and then of course the actual name, we said the last word tells you what's most important about it, and then you work your way back. All right, and that's how we name the different types of soil. The last thing I want to talk about is a soil profile. A profile is, if you took someone's profile, that would just be a side view of their face and shaded in. So, all right, that's not a very good profile, but anyhow, you can see that's someone's profile, although I think I got a little bit outside the lines here, but there we go. That would be someone's profile. Here's his eye and whatever. If we shaded that in, that would be his profile. That's your side view. Your best side, of course. Some of us don't have bad sides, but you know how that is. Anyhow, so this is a soil profile. If you were to slice through the ground and look at the side of the profile, sometimes you can see this on the side of the road where they've dug into the dirt and stuff, and you have a high cliff side on the side, or someone's digging trenches or something like that. You get to see a soil profile, but most of the time we can't actually see this. But we can drill and pipe. For example, when people are drilling for pipes and stuff, they're taking out these cores from the middle of here as they drill a pipe down there. Then they can look at those cores, and that would give us an idea of what the soil profile would look like. Okay, and the soil profile, the first layer is the O horizon. O in this case stands for organic. Okay, so this is the layer that has like dead leaves and stuff like that. It's not actually soil, technically. There's no rock particles hardly in this top layer. It's just all the dead matter that lays up. If you're in a forested area, this might be a very important area. The rainforest, in fact, this is almost where all the nutrients and the roots of the trees and so forth are, because the soils are fairly poor. It's all the nutrients are up here in the O horizon. Okay. On the other hand, if you're in drier areas, prairies and deserts, very often you may not even have an O horizon. You may have bare soil, and this happens very often. And depending where you're talking about in your yard or something, you might see the same kind of thing. O horizon is generally a good thing because these are nutrients that can break down and work their way in the soil, and they also make the soil where it doesn't get so hard, and it makes it more easier to work and so forth like that. So that's a good thing. Now, the next one is the A horizon. Okay, the A horizon is also known as the topsoil because this is the actual first layer of rock particle-y stuff, and therefore the true soil. Okay, and it tends to have more organic material because all this organic material is being worked into it by worms and ants and various things like that. So it tends to have a lot more organic material in it, and this is where most of the plant roots are going to be. Okay, at least the small plants. Now trees obviously are going to send roots down into the lower layers down here in order to anchor themselves, as well as sending them far out on each side. But the A horizon is where a lot of the roots are. This is where the nutrients and the active growth goes, and so forth. Okay. Now, as we get to the next layer, which is the B horizon, okay, and the B horizon, you will notice that there is hardly any organic matter, and so forth like this. There is some roots will get down this far, but there's not going to be a lot of nutrients down here, and we're getting farther away from that sort of thing. Now, as we get down here to the C horizon, which makes sense, okay, the A, B, C so far, other than the O horizon on top, now we're getting into what we would call, I'm sorry, the B horizon is the subsoil, because it's not the topsoil, it's the subsoil. The topsoil is what you go and pay a whole bunch of money per bag, because it's where all the nutrients are. When it gets removed, or if it washes away from erosion, now you're this subsoil, B horizon, and it's not really got the nutrients and stuff yet. It takes a while for it to build up that organic matter and so forth. So it's generally not going to be as good soil. The C horizon, notice you're starting to get a lot of rocks and so forth, and this, we got a lot of rock and stuff. Okay, and this is where the parent material, which is the rocks down here, are starting to break down and stuff like that into soil, but once again, it's getting rockier. And finally, eventually, you're going to hit what we call the R layer, and that's basically just the bedrock. Okay, when you hit the bedrock, it's just solid rock, and there's nothing else. Now, keep in mind that how deep these layers are vary. We said like dry areas and more desert areas may not have an O horizon at all, or just maybe very loose scattering. Others, it may be 6 inches thick or so, depending on a deep forest or something like that. It might be very thick. Okay, A horizons, the topsoil, some places very deep. Like tall grass prairies, some of our prairies have very deep topsoils. Okay, because they're low spots, and there were things have washed down from the mountains. If, here's your mountains, and everything washes down here, and it's been deposited. So there's very rich layers all the way through the middle of the Great Plains and over to Iowa and Illinois and places like that. Lots of deep soils here. So they may have a deep topsoil and subsoil. Other places, like in the mountains, the surface layer might be the C horizon down here, where it's just rocks and a little bit of stuff in between it, and then you don't have to go very far at all, and you hit solid rock, the bedrock. So that can be very definitely, it wouldn't have all these other layers on top of it. So this is just kind of a general rule of the possible layers, but not necessarily that all of them will be present in all cases. And here's just kind of a summary of the notes that we did here. So we have the O horizon, which is your litter, humus, dead organic matter. Your A horizon, topsoil, is where living organisms, most of the roots, some organic matter is. B horizon, subsoil, roots of larger plants. C horizon, where we have parent material that's actually breaking down into soil, so rock fragments are getting broken down. And then your R layer or bedrock. And that just kind of summarizes that. And I think that will be it. We'll hopefully do a couple of soil activities in class, and that will finish us up for soils.